summer Bible study series on Paul, the life of Paul, and some of the writings of Paul. And so tonight, our topic is going to be the end of fun, Paul and pleasure. You'll remember last week I told you we were going to cover 3 chapters tonight. Forget about that, because this one is so detailed and I got deeply into it, and we're just going to pay attention to the detail and do it. I really did not want to rush through particularly the next chapter on Paul and homosexuality, so we'll do that next week, and then we'll do, Armando, you might not be here, I'll send you the notes. You'll be able to see them and get them. And then if we have time next week, we'll look at how to read a Pauline letter as an end part, and then we'll move into Romans. So we might have to add a week or so to the end of our schedule, but we'll just work around it the best we can and get it all in there, rather than me trying to rush through things that might mean something to us. So tonight, I'm using Sarah Rudin's book, Paul Among the People. The total complete name of this chapter is The End of Fun, Paul and Pleasure. No closets and no monsters. So we'll get there. This is Sarah Rudin. I showed you this picture before, but and you all had the same reaction last time. She's popular here. But this is her, and we're going to be exclusively using her materials and my interpretations of it tonight, so I always want to give credit to my sources and encourage you, if you're interested, to purchase a copy of this book at Amazon or your favorite bookseller. So the end of fun is where we start tonight. There is a lot of reading, and normally I give you a heads up that that's coming. So somebody just jump in and read, and if you don't, I will. But I think it'll help us not to just hear my voice the whole time. So here's the big question. What was Paul's real message about the body? And we don't mean the body of Christ now, we mean these bodies and social life. And my first suggestion to you is don't ask the Puritans, or at least don't buy into everything they said. This is a picture of what Puritans might have looked like. Notice, over here it looks like this one is already expired or died or is getting close to it. The children are showing no body parts whatsoever. That might be a little hand there. Notice the stockings there, and this really, so I like the colors, but nobody looks happy. Do you notice? So that's where we're starting. Sarah Rudin says, when they, the Puritans, gained power and sought to wipe out the enjoyments, i.e. games, drama, feasting, dancing, and, by the way, fancy hats, and these are the ones that the medieval church had spared, by the way, the main New Testament authority alleged, or that they claimed, was Paul. Now, whether that actually can be a viable claim or not, we'll see. But they claimed that their ideas and their teaching were based on the teachings of Paul. Richard Baxter is an important source for them, who lived 1615 to 1691 and wrote Direction to Weak Christians. And in that was directions against master sin, sensuality, flesh-pleasing, and voluptuousness. Now, again, kind of like some of the things we deal with today, if you're voluptuous, I think you just are. It's not something that one can help. But Baxter condemned what we would consider ordinary and natural pleasures. Not even the outrageous ones, just the ordinary and natural ones. And this is a depiction of him. He certainly looks very Puritan. A little smile. He's getting great pleasure out of depriving the rest of us of ours, I think. So, somebody read for us this first reading.
Do you think that man is made for no higher matters than a beast, and that you have not a more noble object for your delight than your swine or dog hath, who have the pleasure of meat and lust and play and ease and fancy as well as you? Certainly where sensual pleasures are preferred before the higher pleasures of the soul, that man becomes a beast, or worse, subjecting his reason to his brutish part.
Brutish part. We'll hear a lot about that. So the danger, big danger, is flesh-pleasing. That is not a term that we know so well today, but it was very highly featured in his writings. So let me just pop us through this real quick. Flesh-pleasing is the very rebellion of corrupted nature. Notice, corrupted. The turning of all things upside down, the taking down God and heaven and reason, and destroying the use of all the creatures, and setting up flesh-pleasing instead of all, and making brute of your God and governor. And do you ask what harm there is in this? So will your child do when he or she desireth any play or pleasure, and the sick when the desire to please their appetite. Horrible sounding stuff. So Baxter refers to Paul's fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5, 5 different times. Does anybody remember what the fruits of the Spirit are? But the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. I still remember that from the Baptist Sunday School, by the way. But that's what they are. So the primary source for Baxter is a pair of Paul's lists showing what not to do to indulge the flesh compared to these fruits of the Spirit. And it's also important for us to note, like we do when we're talking about holiness codes, there are many codes. Well, Paul has lots of lists, and we'll talk about some of those as we go. So we're looking at Galatians 5, which does have some common themes in it. It focuses on false teachings, false prophets, false messages. It focuses on practices that alienate us not only from God, but also from community, because Galatians was a group that Paul was interested in building as a community. It gives us criteria for spiritual fruit. It shows us how a group of believers can tell that they are going in the right way, or in other words, whether the Spirit is leading them or not. And it gives us quite a bit of idea about what might be considered bad behaviors. The important part, though, is that fourth one: how can a group of believers tell that they are going the right way, or whether they are following the direction of the Spirit or not? What is Galatians 5 about? It is about a link between religion and getting along with other people, which doesn't mean just tolerating them. You hear that tolerance word a lot. But it means showing that we care for them and also allowing the community to thrive as an individual focus as much as the focus on individuals thriving as part of it. It's about a new way of thinking that would have been very exciting to them, because it brings hope for something beyond exploitation and chattel slavery and materialism and violence, and it offers a plan not for competing in purity and the denial of life, but for sharing a full life. You know, people who buy into these codes and these lists and all these rules, I always say it gets me in trouble. I like guidelines a lot better than rules. But a lot of people who get real legalistic want to build themselves up by how closely they follow the law. I sometimes see out in public these, not that there's anything wrong with it, but these obviously Pentecostal women who have hair hanging down to their heels. I'm wondering how you can do that and keep it clean at the same time, but I don't ask. But anyway, or people that, so devoutly go to church on Saturday, or it's got to be on Sunday, or it's got whatever, Friday, because it represents how holy they are. Or women who deliberately, for religious reasons, no matter how bad they mean it, refuse to wear makeup. And I remember when I was in Stetson, a girl, whose father was actually a Pentecostal preacher, who was told she couldn't sing in the choir because, quote, the Bible says to keep the scissors out of your hair. Now, it never really says that. But
Can't sing in the choir.
she couldn't sing in the choir because she was a bad example to the other women who were not supposed to cut their hair. It was very sad. She came home crying one night over that. Anyway, so now this is going to be a tricky read. So you got to have your eyes open and your mind open, because I have put this in exactly the Old English, the way it would have been in King James English. Does somebody want to try this on, or you want me to do it since I have a clue? Or yeah, I think you can do it. So this is Galatians 5:19-21 in the Old King's English.
Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies.
This means
Goodness.
envy, but envyings.
Okay. Drunkenness.
Oh, that other word is separate though.
Oh, envyings, murderers.
That means murderers.
Okay. Drunkenness.
That should be, it would pronounce revelings.
Okay, and such like.
Only one thought.
Thou, which I tell you before, as I have also told you in the time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God.
Good job. Let's give her a hand. Very good. So, some questions to think about. Would people of Paul's time have read him as preaching against natural desires and ordinary fun? Question number one. Number two is, what exactly did these words mean about the way people were expected to live according to this new religion? So we're going to try to answer those questions. So first of all, we have to picture Paul in the setting. And there are some things that we do know about Paul, both about his character and somewhat about the way he looked. Remember that these people were meeting for prayer and to eat, basically, in some of the most upstanding homes in Gainesville, or whatever community they might have been. But these are the pillars of the community. And so we know that Paul had a hard time fitting into that setting because he was a very poor speaker. He was not a trained theologian or a trained speaker. He was a scrawny and sickly little man. He was not nice looking at all. He was ill-tempered, which shows up in his letters over and over again. And his basic attitude was that if you disagreed with them, or his rivals, he said, could, quote, go castrate themselves. In Galatians 5, verse 12, just in case you want to verify that that's a biblical setting or reference. So there's this list of these grave sins, and we're going to look at several of them in detail and some of them in not so much details. But the list in modern English, we're abandoning that old English really fast. Any idea what this one is? No? It's a man and a woman. Yes, who said adultery? There we go. Okay. So adultery. And there are many translation difficulties when we get to this word. For Greeks, the meaning was very much different from what it is to us today. The Greek word in my southern dialect is moikos, a root word that means a man, married or not, having sex with another man's wife. So the man could be married or single, but the woman was married. And so rage and extreme punishment, I'll tell you now, including death, were aimed at him, but not at the wife. It automatically, however, broke up the wife's household. And here is the very bad part about it, is that the main victims of the crime were the children who at that very moment became classified as illegitimate. It doesn't necessarily imply that these children came from the adulterous act. It also includes the children of the wife and her husband. but for them, they automatically became classified as illegitimate children, which meant that they could not inherit property, which was the big hope for everybody at the time. It meant that they lost their citizenship when they grew up. They were not allowed to marry people who were citizens, and boys were completely excluded from the all-important political life of the city. An adulterer, the male only, remember, was viewed as worse than a pedophile would be viewed in our current culture. Why? Because it had such an impact on the children. It was a wanton crime because nobody had to do it. As a matter of fact, there were much better options that were very much available to people. For example, prostitution, which had absolutely no social stigma about it whatsoever. It was legal. It was not a matter of morality. It was just an option that people had. All kinds of sexual opportunities were present with women who were not married. Sometimes it was for pay, and many times it was for free. And again, understand, in this culture, there were no moral implications whatsoever. Prostitutes and women, single women who were willing to have sex were just part of the culture and not that much looked down upon. There was no romantic sympathy at all for adulterers. No excuses like, well, I just couldn't help it. Or my heart, well, I was just obsessed with her and my heart was drawn to her and I just had to do it. And I just could, there's none of that was entertained whatsoever. So society had an open season on adulterers, again, just the men, and that included killing them. Now, when I say just the men, let me say, there's no justification for the consequences that came on these children who had nothing to do with it, were not responsible for their mother's behavior, certainly were not responsible for the adulterous man's behavior, but seemed to bear the brunt of it, unless you consider losing one's life as the real brunt of the situation. So, this is a little graphic, so if you have a weak stomach, don't volunteer to read it, but somebody, would you read this for me and it'll give us an idea. We shoved open the bedroom door, and those of us who came in first saw him lying next to my wife, while those behind us saw him only when he was standing naked on the bed. Now I, gentlemen of the jury, hit him and knocked him down, pulled his hands behind his back and tied them together, and asked him how he had the gall to come into my house. He admitted that what he was doing was a crime, that he groveled and pleaded with me not to kill him, but to make a deal for cash. But I told him, it's not me who's going to kill you, but the law of this city which you have violated. You thought your fun was more important, and you chose to commit this outrage against my wife and children rather than obey the laws and heaven decently. In this way, jurymen, the man got what the law decrees for those who do this sort of thing. In other words, the plaintiff at the time was saying, I killed him, and he got exactly what the law called for. Now that's Greek culture. We're going to shift a little bit now to Roman culture and their view of adultery. Number one, it was a little less harsh, although not that much. Thankfully, a child born within a marriage was still legitimate, unless the husband claimed he was not. I guess the husband could still say, okay, my children are now illegitimate. Catching the wife in the act still meant almost always, with a few exceptions, that this was the end of the marriage. It was over. And treatment of adulterers was still brutal. The poet Horace wrote about adultery in the 1st century BC, and this is what he had to say. Would somebody, can you see that? Like to read it?
For those who want adulterers to stumble, it's worthwhile hearing all the ways they suffer. Their pleasure is rare and agony infects it, and all around them savage dangers lurk. This guy dove straight down from a roof. Another was whipped to death. The third one met a fierce gang of bandits while he fled. One bought survival. Stable boys squirted into one. It happened that this one's offender's balls and a randy tail were reaped off. That's the law, said everyone.
Everybody understand randy tail is what's attached to the balls, right? Okay, so it was ripped off. And I'm not even going to speculate on the real meaning of stable boys squirted into one. I think we can figure that out. Pretty brutal stuff. This was adultery for Paul's Greco-Roman audience. Nearly everybody in the Roman Empire would be prone to feel that Paul, rather than making a harsh new rule, was only seconding a humane and sensible one that they had already had. This would have been the view of Paul if this was truly what he was endorsing. So adultery and then fornication. I just couldn't help this in light of what's going on with the nuns in the Catholic Church today. So, first of all, fornication is the wrong word. Porneia, in essence, meant treating another human being as a thing or an object. There simply is no English word that captures all of the essence of this word. Not fornication, and really not even immorality, which is the choice that more recent scholars have made, because it's just too broad. It doesn't get right down to the details. It boils down to the mistreatment of others, using others, and behavior that treats a person like an object. The word in its purest form means to buy. It's like I buy you for my own pleasure, and you become an object, not a person. I view you as for lack of a better thing, just take a deep breath, a sex toy, rather than as a person that I'm going to have a relationship with. It is very unlikely that porneia meant all consensual extramarital sex, which is our common definition of fornication. Paul implies that brutality is also involved, so it could be like, sadomasochistic behavior, beating a partner, hitting, doing things so violent in the act that it can cause physical damage to a partner. And this is really what porneia, which is the original word, refers to. There's this comic pimp, as it's called by Sarah Rudin Lipser, who was around in the 3rd century BC. And the best I can tell, Myrtle is probably a slave. But it says, "Now for you, Myrtle, come let's these men see all. Don't be embarrassed. Think of them as your fathers and your brothers that's here to judge the case. Look, gentlemen, at how he shredded her clear up and down." This is what I was referring to a minute ago. "The son of a bitch has torn her nearly bare. He dragged her, beat her silly. Maybe you want Myrtle. That's no problem. I want my food. We'll swap the two of them. By Zeus, you've got an urge there in your innards. Just stuff her price in the old lisper's hand and bruise your goods up any way you want." The most outrageous joke here is that the pimp, in his stupidity and insults the jury by comparing her to their freeborn citizen female relatives, a species viewed as high above her, sort of as horses are viewed as above gnats. The absolute insanity of referring to a woman this way as an object sort of illustrates exactly what porneia, that buying and objectification of someone, represents. And then we get to uncleanliness. So we've had adultery, we've had fornication, and now we have uncleanliness. And let me just say, this picture totally misrepresents intentionally what Paul is talking about. It goes with uncleanliness and lasciviousness. And we know that for Greeks and Romans as well, and Hebrews, uncleanliness was more of a public and ritual state than it was an inward and moral one. A person might have been unclean when he or she entered the temple, but the anger implied was not about his own or her own uncleanliness, but because they had marred or ruined the place for everyone else. You see, once it becomes unclean, not only I might have made it unclean, but you can't touch it either. So your experience in this place, maybe the temple, is ruined too. And uncleanliness is viewed as contagious, because if I am unclean and I make this table unclean and you touch the table, then you're unclean too. And then if you go touch her and she goes and touches him, and so on and so forth, everything and everybody becomes unclean. So it's also contagious. And so when we get to lasciviousness, licentiousness is a better translation, actually. It makes more sense to us. It carries its usual meaning of irresponsibility, either sexual or otherwise. However, it may wrongly suggest feelings as well as acts. That kind of thinking makes people insane. So I'll illustrate for you. When I was growing up, you maybe have heard this too, it wasn't just the act that became sinful. I was taught that even if I thought about a boy, that was sinful too. I remember, I might have told you this before, growing up in Florida with all these thunderstorms. Trust me, I was thinking plenty about boys by the time I was 10, 11, 12. And I just knew that this thunderstorm was God coming to get me. Not that I had done anything necessarily by the time I was that age, but because I had just thought about it. And it's this kind of stuff that just drives people crazy. You know, we try to control our thoughts. Well, you know, I don't care how, I hope at least, you might have been married for 40 years or with your partner for 40 years or 18. And when something that looks good goes by, it still looks good. And you might think, wow, that could be interesting. That's what you're supposed to do because you're alive. Yes, Jim.
I'd heard what you had said first, if you thought about it, and then I heard it sort of change sometime in the 80s or 90s that you could look once, but if you looked twice, that the second time was supposed to be a sin.
Well, you know, maybe, but I just got to tell you, if that's the case, I'm in bad trouble.
So I don't know.
I've looked twice a lot of times. And so what I think is that it's impossible to squeeze out of what Paul really has to say any inference against sex or sexual desire. But what happens is that Paul is really more concerned with distractions and worries that marriage even brought, and the evil manifestation of exploitative or promiscuous sex can distract us from what we're called to. In other words, you know, if we get so caught up in that all we're ever thinking about is sex or our next partner or even focusing, I mean, if you're driving down the street looking for good-looking men or women to the point that you're running off the street, you probably got a problem. But it's that point where it goes over the line of natural desires to unhealthy ones or even dangerous ones that becomes the problem. So then we turn to idolatry. So let's remember what we've done. We did, what was first? Adultery. Second, remember the nun? Fornication, uncleanliness, and lasciviousness. And so now we're going to idolatry. And we're clear where we are, what we're saying about each one. Adultery, misappropriated consequences, really. What was the nun? Fornication, objectification, etc. Okay, idolatry. Basically worshiping objects. Paul's focus is something like fornication for pay. People can, in Paul's mind, only worship a living thing, which means God, with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. Animals are excluded. Now, I'm not saying I agree with this point, by the way, but animals are excluded because while they are living, they don't have any sense. Okay? It says they're I'm not coming up with the exact word. Basically, it means they don't have any sense. And so educated Greeks and Romans agreed with Paul. So Paul viewed these other expressions, including violent expressions of witchcraft, as evil. So if you were worshiping, like in the previous slide, some man-made object, if you were worshiping a rock, if you were worshiping, trees have life, so we can't really exclude that. But they might be nonsensical to the person who didn't understand. But if you're worshiping that chair or this table, no life, no sense, then you are just wasting your time. There's this idea about, with Paul now, we're going to take a little detour here, about new life versus new death. This next section of Galatians 5 focuses on Paul's firm belief in a new life as a miracle. And what we know is that new life enables Paul, in some mystical sense, to go back and undo some of the evil acts that he had done in his past. And if he can't do that, there is this sense that God, when God intervened with Paul, went back and undid that automatically or through some divine act. We know that Paul never overcomes exactly who Paul is. He's still moody, he's still fussy, and he's still arrogant. And here we go, notice the asterisk, because I said this was going to be one of the things we talked about. Maybe the thorn in the flesh for Paul could have been more about his anger, which he never mastered, than lust. Maybe. But the truth is, even though he never overcame it, he learned to put boundaries around his worst faults. In other words, for the most part, he kept them under control. And we know that in spite of whatever his faults were, Paul sets out to save the world. And whether he saves it or not, we don't know for sure, but we certainly know that he overcame it. And we also can know, as we look back, that the Puritans completely overlooked this focus of Paul. It was not about rules. It was not a new kind of killing people by making us miserable, in that we have to deny our natural desires and affections and even a natural level of sensuality. But it was about bringing new life, and by acknowledging that in ways that would change the world rather than just killing us by making us miserable. The next thing we get to is drunkenness. I just couldn't resist that picture. So drunkenness. Now let's just acknowledge that drunk is drunk. So I don't care if I've had my half a glass of Pinot Noir and get buzzed, or you've had your 14 gin and tonics before you hit it, whatever it takes to get there, drunk is drunk. So if I'm drunk on my half glass of Pinot Noir, I'm drunk. Placing it right next to the word translated as reveling gives it a very different focus from that of the Puritan panic over self-denial and self-control. Paul's mention of it is about social behavior and the health of the community as much as it is about the dangerous implications for an individual. Remember, wine was the ordinary beverage at meals. It was their iced tea, as we would view it in the South. Probably diluted, so wine mixed with water so that you could drink enough of it to have with your meal and still avoid potentially being drunk. I started to say too drunk, but I just said drunk is drunk, so we're not going to qualify it. What Paul refers to is the behavior that went on even after getting drunk and even after a little bit of carousing or just having a normal amount of a good time. So somebody read this first paragraph for me if you can see it.
A group of men marching down the street at night, drunk, wearing garlands, carrying torches, and making loud music. The flute girls might go along as accompanist. In
Base
In vase paintings, they are depicted as part man, part goat, wholly outside civilization, with giant penises and a reputation for wild lust. And their accompanists are nymphs, their main sexual partners.
So that is what Paul is actually writing to avoid. And why? Paul's not writing about a good, fun, healthy party in general. He doesn't say anything wrong about that. He doesn't say, don't, only drink wine for medicinal purposes. He doesn't say don't drink wine, don't drink alcohol. But what he's writing about is a specific tradition that comes after the party and after the little bit of fun to actual, carrying on in ways that are not good for men and not good for women and not good for the neighborhood. And so, as we said before, Paul is writing about behavior that distracts from or takes away from the experience of community, that interferes with the building of a positive community where everyone is respected and given dignity and equality, which we're still trying to work on. So, the next piece that's important is inheritance. And it's a little bit related to our idea of inheritance, but it's also what some writers refer to as a salvation fantasy, almost like an escape clause, which we've talked about in some of our other studies. It's true that inheritance of money and or property usually only occurred for the very rich. And we know that to some extent that's still true in our own society. Even today, very few inherit enough money or property or stuff to really make a difference in their lives, much less to live on. And most of us are accustomed anyway to the idea that we have to sort of make our own way in the world for our lives to continue. Even if we inherit a little bit, we've got to be responsible with it. Even if we inherit a lot, we have to be even more responsible with it. But most of us, and I say most, really do get it, that making a way in the world is our own responsibility. However, picture this in the context of slaves, freedmen, laborers, soldiers, wanderers, colonists, hucksters, prostitutes, artists, struggling entrepreneurs on the shoestring, and all others who are really struggling. I mean, probably not people who are able to be in this building necessarily, although we hope we would welcome them. And for them, the idea of inheriting the kingdom of God really was a fantasy that came along with the concept of salvation. And so Sarah Rudin says, quote, "For real people, the inheritance fantasy probably wasn't founded only on greed. It was like also a fantasy of belonging fully, which was impossible unless you had a household. The basic thing inherited, and a very arduous thing to put together on your own, was this household. So Christianity offered anyone, no matter how poor and powerless, an alternative inheritance, another kind of home, and a new way to belong." And so this salvation fantasy was so appealing. It's kind of like, and it gets people in trouble today, that this fantasy that if I spend my grocery money on a lotto ticket and I can just get the winning one, everything's going to be okay. It's that level of fantasy. I'm not saying that one is wrong and one is right or both are wrong, but it's that deep longing of an experience of not having enough. And because you don't have enough, being viewed as a total outsider. And then comes along this new life idea, or this salvation fantasy that means that you can be included, and you all of a sudden, for the first time in your life, you have the experience of belonging to something, and that something becomes this community that suddenly people can be a part of after not being a part of it for their whole lives. So, Paul's message was not about obeying these strictures or rules against human nature, or we'll kick you out of the community you were born into. But instead, Paul's message is more like, we offer you an equal share of a community, such as most of you could only dream of before. You forfeit it only if you are disorderly, through these destructive acts that are not even attractive in comparison to the life you could be leading. No wonder Christianity grew like mad. I mean, can you just imagine the difference? Now, I want us to have an honest look at this whole section of Galatians and just take it as a broad reading rather than sort of piecemeal. So would somebody read this first screen for us, and then we'll switch as we go.
For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another.
So what does it seem like Paul's focus is there? Break that down.
He's saying our freedom is to take care of each other.
And by taking care of each other, we build community. And so the focus here is not on individual acts. It's not that it may be, but it's not that it's so bad for me if I go out and get drunk off of my butt. But that if I go out and get drunk off my butt and my behavior is really, really bad, and people come to view me as a representative, especially a leader of the community, then I've destroyed the community. I've impacted the community. I've taken away from the quality of the community. And so, if I go around bad-mouthing everybody, it's not so much that I'm just an angry old man. It's that I'm taking away from the reputation of the community. Well, you know, that Reverend Merritt said all those people just gossip and complain and fight with each other and rip each other apart. And, you know, I don't want to be part of that. So it's the damage that's done to the community that is Paul's focus more than any list of rules that we have to follow. Now, let's read this next part.
Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not
Oopsie, sorry.
gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to prevent you from doing what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not subject to the law. Now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I am warning you, as I warned you before. Those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God.
So, this is my sort of radical question. Where is the kingdom, or the kingdom, as we say, of God? Out there somewhere?
Well, it's our community.
It's our community. You'll often hear me say we are an outpost of the kingdom of God. And so, again, Paul is not focusing on necessarily fornication, impurity, licentiousness, etc., because of the damage they do to us as individuals, or even because they necessarily alienate the individual from the kingdom of God. What Paul's focus is that when members of the community or the kingdom behave in this way, the kingdom is torn down, and therefore, when it's torn down, there's nothing left for us to inherit. He's focusing on the communal experience of being a follower of Jesus. Now, by contrast, how do I turn this off? Somebody tell me those fruits of the Spirit again.
Joy, peace.
Good.
Self-control.
That's one. Now you got them out of order. I'm in trouble. But I'll try.
What do you say? Love, joy,
Yeah.
peace,
We've got love, joy, peace, self-control.
forgiveness. It should be.
Yes, that's one. Now I'm all out of order. Anybody else? Name another one. The fruits of the Spirit. We'll learn this tonight. The fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. Forgiveness is not one of them. And self-control. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Who can say it? Besides me. Ready? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Now somebody try it. What was the first one?
Love,
Second one?
joy,
Third?
peace,
Patience.
patience,
Yes. K word.
kindness, gentleness,
Gentleness,
faithfulness,
faithfulness.
gentleness,
I'm lost now.
Gentle-
Love, joy,
gentleness
peace,
and
patience,
goodness.
kindness, goodness, faithfulness. It's a
Gentleness,
G word. Gentleness.
self-control.
Okay, somebody want to try to say the whole thing?
love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness.
Goodness,
Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness.
goodness,
Goodness, forgiveness,
no, faithfulness,
faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control.
Okay, all together. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Now, I think that was about a 5th or 6th grade Baptist Sunday school lesson. We just had the whole thing. All right, good. Now, by contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. Now, this says generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against these things. So what is Paul saying? Do this.
Yeah.
Do it. Focus on this. Do this. Practice it. Do it over and over again. Repeat it, etc., etc. Now, I like the way Gruden does this chart of contrasts of opposing forces. So let's look at this. True liberty is different from self-indulgence. How? Absolutely. Because if your freedom goes against my nose, then what happens? The community begins to be impacted. Okay? Love and service opposed to being overcome with the desires of the flesh. I want to love you. I want to serve you. I want to honor you as a person. You are not just an object for the desires of my flesh. I can't buy you. You're not for sale. That kind of thing. Love and law as opposed to tearing one another down. You know, we can fight and carry on really all we want to individually. But the danger is that when we get in the habit of tearing each other down, we also tear down the community, the kingdom of God. Spirit, our spirits, living by the Spirit, as opposed to both things, living completely by the desires of the flesh, and Spirit versus a bunch of rules, the burden of the law, the holiness codes, for example. Living by the Spirit, filled with peace. Oh, come on now.
Patience,
Love, joy,
joy,
peace,
patience, kindness, Gentleness,
faithfulness.
Goodness, and
Gentleness.
self-control.
I heard a couple of gentleness, but you're close enough. You're getting it. So, and then Christ versus living for the kingdom of God, the kingdom of the Son of God, versus just living according to our own flesh and lusts, with passions, self-indulgences. In other words, we want to build up the kingdom as followers of Christ rather than just living by our own desires. And then following the Spirit, which leads us to love, joy, peace.
patience,
Love, joy,
peace,
peace,
patience, kindness,
goodness, faithfulness,
gentleness,
self-control. Spirit versus egotism and resentment. I'm going to do what I want to do because I am free, and I'm certainly in this culture I'm a man and I can just do what I want to do. And if you interfere with that, God help you, because I'm going to resent you and I'm going to talk about you and I'm going to fight with you, even if it tears down the whole community. Spirit versus egotism and resentment. Now, Paul's points, the real ones. It's not that the body, this thing that God built us in, or nature is bad and the mind or the spirit is good. It is about two ways of using the body. One is for life that is worth living, not just now, but forever. And the other one is for a life that is basically as good as death in the short time, because it will just vanish. In other words, if we give in to just out of control desires of the flesh, then it all kind of burns up. And you've heard me say, beware your seed of anger, resentment, because it'll burn your spiritual house down. This is exactly what Paul is saying. This passage is not an angry homily or an angry sermon, but it's a shout out to people who are standing hesitant on the 13th story ledge. In other words, people have a choice to make. They can choose to live completely overcome with their own desires, or they can choose to join in a community that represents life. It does not mean there's no fun. It doesn't mean you can never have sex. It doesn't mean you can never drink alcohol. It doesn't mean you can never, have some inheritance positively. But what it does mean is that you cannot be overcome by those desires, because if we fail as community, what happens? We all die. Nobody is an island. No man or woman is an island. The practice of following Jesus means that we live in community. We cannot do it on our own. And Paul, given all his anger and all his nasty mouth and his not being so desirable and letting people have it, cannot let his listeners die. Now, I love what Sarah Rudin says in her summary about Paul and who Paul is. Let me just read this. My image of Paul, I'm quoting her now, is never going to be the same, she says after having read in the original languages the texts of Paul. How did I ever accept the fairy tale of an apostle walking, now you got to picture this, walking into communities of happy pagans at peace with nature and their bodies, and shutting down the maypole dances to the dancers' mysterious bloom. Got the irony there, they wouldn't be grateful about that. Instead, Paul sacrificed his home, his health, his peace of mind, and eventually his life for the sake of the Greeks and Romans, whom, since they are long dead, it should not be politically incorrect to call kindergartners with knives. He must have helplessly, sufferingly loved them. Now, I want us to think about that, kindergartners with knives. What are behaviors that seem like that? Out of control, egotism. Out of control drunkenness. Out of control desires of the flesh, sensuality. Out of control sexual desire that says, I'm going to buy you. You're no longer a person, you're an object that I bought. I own you. Kindergartners with knives. What I want is so much more than what the community needs. That the community can die so I can satisfy my own desires. See? Paul's not calling off the party. In many ways, Paul's endorsing the party within boundaries. Yes, Jim.
He's just saying be responsible.
Within responsible boundaries. And when we get out of bounds with it, let it go take us over, let it consume us, Paul would say, then the community dies. So, Paul is not the end of fun. Paul is the end of being overtaken by godly desires. Everything that we are, I tell people all the time, God created that body fully knowing everything it was capable of doing. If God didn't want it to do that, it wouldn't do it. Because God made it. And if you buy into that description about animals, human beings are animals that have sense. So we have to use our brains, influenced by the Spirit, to provide boundaries around our practice of fun. Fun is okay. Tearing down the community is not. That's what I think Paul is saying to us. That's what Rudin obviously thinks Paul is saying to us. So what do you think? Does that sound ludicrous to you?
I mean, his letters are scattered with references to the community. If you do something that you think is that you don't consider a sin, there's not a sin unless it causes someone else to stumble. He talks on and on and on about community and sharing with each other, literally as well as spiritually, and is literally and spiritually.
And I want to just lift out two modern examples of that. Maybe not so modern, so I'm going to go back to when I was growing up again. The whole recent history, yes, I love you for that. Recent history, I was taught that if I went into a restaurant and had a glass of wine and it caused you to stumble, that was wrong, sinful. I don't really think Paul is saying it. Because I can go into a restaurant and have, for me, half a glass of wine because of my stomach being, for those of you watching on video, I had bariatric surgery a long time ago. But anyway, because of my stomach being small, a half a glass will do it. So, nothing wrong with that. But if I go in there and drink the whole glass, and glass after glass after glass, and my behavior gets out of control, and I do things that tear down the community, that's the problem. Second, people say that we are wrong just for being. We are the people God created us to be. But when we allow our behavior to get out of control, especially those stereotypical behaviors, then it's when it begins to tear down the community. And then those behaviors become wrong. But we don't become wrong by being the people God created us to be, not prohibiting fun, but our behavior within boundaries. What else do you think about that? Other thoughts?
I don't want to be the one talking, but I'm thinking about the economy and the elitism attitude that has been taken you know, like you said, the knees, and I think about the Wall Street versus Main Street and things like that.
There is also, you know, when we were talking about inheritance and the salvation fantasy, which is not a bad term, by the way, there is this implication that when we inherit a lot, to the one that's given much is expected kind of thing. It's not all about ourselves, because when we're living in community, it's for the good of the community.
I think that sign needs to be around a lot. Much is given, much is expected. A lot of people. And I'm not saying money, I'm just saying when you're given a community, you have the responsibility to give support.
You know, we always talk so much and have to lately about money, but there is that time and talent piece, and some people
That's
are
right.
just given incredible gifts
Yes, they do.
that would be helpful to share or share more of. What other implications do you see in this discussion tonight?
And you see the fact that people don't put things in historical context, that you can read things way out of whack.
Yeah, see, and you get the perfect example of that with the Puritan approach, which completely overlooks the purpose of Paul's life, post-conversion life, and wants to go back to the rules as a way of controlling people. And, I mean, literally, I mean, for my part, you may disagree with me, if you follow all those rules, there is no fun. You can't even wear a fancy hat, for God's sakes. You know? Forget about walking down the street drunk.
Well, you weren't, Puritan women weren't even allowed to wear jewelry,
No.
you know, or anything, you know, wedding rings, because it could be fancier than somebody
Yeah,
else's, and you
yeah.
didn't want to put yourself above,
So,
you know, anybody else. So it was, you know, very strict and dour and things like that.
Not
So
even colors.
not even colors, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons I chose that picture of Puritans, because it was so colorful.
Yeah.
And I'm
well,
like,
the
well,
colors, the black and white that you see was the Sunday dress.
Right.
The other colors were the day-to-day colors were what you got from nature.
right.
So it was actually, I did a thing on this when I was teaching, that their everyday colors are actually a bit more colorful than you would expect. And actually one of the popular colors for underwear was red, because
Right.
that was a common dye color that was used. But it was a lot of the earth tones, you know, grays and browns and oranges and
Yeah, I think which
greens.
time period are we talking about?
Puritans,
Puritans, okay.
yeah, the Pilgrims
Okay.
and stuff. But you know, but the black and white, the real starched pictures you see, that was like going for your Sunday best portrait. But still, you know, you wouldn't have the fancy adornments on it, because that would be putting yourself up,
Right.
and then you would be,
You become a horse rather than a man.
yeah, exactly.
And if you compare that view, where you can't even wear a piece of jewelry, to that picture we later heard about really drunken, carousing, out of control people, men walking down the street. Well, basically it sounds to me like a picture of a man wearing a boa, and with their female accompanists, who really were nymphs, who were there for their sexual pleasure. I mean, it's two totally contrasting and equally inappropriate representations of what Paul is talking about. Any other things you notice about this? What does it say for us? Have a good time. We like that.
Be responsible.
Be responsible, yes.
Guys together, have a good time, but be responsible.
Yes, but be responsible. And I think probably one of the key issues for us in our community is to really focus on building one another up individually, rather than tearing each other down.
Right.
Because we recognize that when we build a person up, we also build up the community. And when we tear a person down, we're also tearing down the community. And that's a tough one for people in our segment of society a lot of time. Not just us, but certainly for us. Okay. Any other hot points? So let's think about next week. I would like for you to either read or finish reading the first chapter of Romans, and don't let it scare you to death. We'll survive it. Next week, we're also going to use Rudin's book, using the No Closet, No Monsters, Paul and Homosexuality. If we have a chance and time, which I think we might, we're going to then shift to how to read a Pauline letter before we jump into Romans. And so that's the plan. Again, because this one chapter took almost an hour and 20 minutes tonight, we're going to, we might have to add a week at the end to finish it all, but I think you are with me that you'd rather add time than rush through important material. All right, that suit everybody understands the plan. Say, ready for the regular good night picture?
Yep.
I really like this one tonight. See the kitty with the mouse. Everybody, they're having community together. They're not killing one another.
And the kitty is smiling.
And the mouse is smiling.
And the mouse is
Yes.
smiling too.
And the mouse has like pink polka dotted ears, which I like.
That's neat.
All right, so that's it for tonight. Thank you very much. And I'll see you soon. And we'll see you when you get back.
Mm-hmm.
Just send on the stuff.
Send the PowerPoint. I will do that.
I'll get to it when I can. Have a good time.
Yes, enjoy. Thank